Hi, welcome back. So, in our last discussion, we looked at Darwin's theory, Darwin's logic, and I said that the reaction to his theory was rather electrifying. And although Darwin's theory was able to explain a large number of things, there were also several things that Darwin's theory could not explain. And very interestingly, Darwin himself discusses a large number of these things in his book and essentially talks about the various ways in which his theory could fail, various kinds of observations which if true would lead to a failure of his theory. Again, this is a shining example of how good science is to be done, because nowadays most people when they write papers, they do not really talk about what are the ways in which their theory can be wrong. Most people are like, here is my theory and this is the best thing after sliced bread. But that is not exactly how science is to be done. For science, one always needs to take into account the possibility that one's theory might be wrong, and therefore one should perhaps pay more attention to what will happen and in how many ways in which your theory can be wrong. So, anyway, so let us look at what are the major objections to Darwin's theory, and as I said, many of these were part of his own book. Now, point to be noted is that I will only deal with a few of these objections right now. That is because right now we are more in a looking at the history of the subject. We will come back to a few other objections in some of the later modules, and many of the objections that we are going to talk about, Darwin actually resolved many of them in his future works, and some of the others were resolved much later. However, again, there is not anything over here which to the best of my knowledge remains unresolved even today. So, objections to Darwin's theory. The first thing is that, remember, Darwin takes variation across traits as an observation. In other words, he takes it as a given. But then what causes this variation in traits within a population? Why is it that some people are say 6 foot tall, others are 5 foot tall, and others everything else in between? Now, unfortunately, Darwin at that point of time had no real answer to this question. However, today when we have understood a lot about genes, how genes express, how environments affect that expression, etc., we actually have a lot more information. I can't really say that we know everything that is there to know about it, but definitely we know a lot more than what Darwin knew about it. This was a very major one. Darwin explicitly said that evolution is a very slow process. Now, he also said that starting from just 1 or 2 life forms, the entire biodiversity, both extinct and existing species, which together represents millions and millions of species, he assumes that all this biodiversity has been generated using that slow process. So, then obviously the question is that did we have enough time for this to happen? Remember, when all this was being discussed, people thought that the earth was perhaps a few thousand or at max a few billion years old. However, Darwin really did not believe that. He actually believed that the earth was a few billion years old. However, during the same time there was this famous physicist Lord Kelvin, who did some experiments basically measuring the temperature at the surface of the earth, and based on what was known about how earth cools, he estimated that earth was much younger. He basically estimated that earth was a few million years old, and therefore his point was that look, there could not have been sufficient time spent on the surface of the earth for all that biodiversity to arise by that slower process. As I said, Darwin did not really believe this, but then Darwin was not a physicist, so he did not really have any way of countering this argument. However, later, much later, people figured out the flaw in Lord Kelvin's arguments, and more importantly, the process of radioactive dating was invented, and once that happened and people got good estimates of the age of the earth, it was clear that earth actually is a pretty ancient planet, definitely a few billion years, and therefore people thought that perhaps the time component is working out. There was sufficient time. Of course, today we understand that Darwin was not entirely correct in thinking that evolution is a very slow process. There are many times when evolution can be extremely fast, species can form over just one generation and so on and so forth. Some of these we are going to talk about in the next module when we discuss the evidences for evolution, but at least even if it is slow, the earth is pretty ancient. That is the main point that I am trying to tell you over here. The next objection to Darwin's theory was, why is it that there are major gaps in fossil record? Now, why is that an objection? Remember, Darwin says that species change very slowly and all species come from pre-existing species, which basically means that if you are finding two species today, there has to be intermediate forms between the two species. So, for example, suppose you say that human beings have arisen from ape like ancestors, then you need to be able to find fossils which are, or maybe other existing organisms which are intermediates between humans and an ape like ancestors. You cannot have a one step change, so Darwin said, going from ape to humans. So, if that be the case, remember this is, we are talking about 170 years back. At that point of time, we did not really have fossil records which were very complete. We essentially had something over here and then something else which is quite a bit different from the previous one and so on. So, how does the fact that fossil records are extremely discontinuous square with Darwin's claim that things are happening continuously and everything is arising from a pre-existing form? So, Darwin made two arguments in his book. His first argument is that, look, we have not really found all the fossils that are there to be found. So, please go around and start looking for more fossils. Incidentally, this argument proved to be correct, and today obviously we do not have continuous every single intermediate form for any divergence, but today the fossil records are way more complete than Darwin's time, which again suggests that in many cases the intermediates which were hypothesized were actually found when people looked for them. The second reason that Darwin said is that, look, fossilization is a very difficult process. There are so many things that need to happen in precisely the correct way before you get a fossil. So, normally whenever an organism dies, what happens? It gets eaten by other organisms, it gets decomposed by the bacteria, right. Therefore, a vast majority of the organisms that die, they never really form fossils. So, Darwin argued that only those organisms which died but were not decomposed, were covered up in a certain way, and then the correct condition of temperature and covering and pressure etc. happened, only they became fossilized, and therefore, it is no wonder that we do not really have fossils for all the intermediate forms. Again, as an argument, this is a pretty decent argument and nobody has really questioned this part, that fossilization is indeed a very difficult and special process. Then, I mean, there are, as I said, there are many other objections, but then came what is one of the most critical objection, which is related to the mechanism of inheritance. Remember, for natural selection to happen, it is crucial that organisms are able to pass their traits to their babies. Okay. So, if a tall parent is not able to pass the trait of tallness, at least to some degree, to its baby, then natural selection cannot happen, right. So, that means that the entire process of inheritance is central to the process of natural selection, and therefore, obviously everybody asked, how does inheritance happen? Now, here things really became problematic. because Darwin, although initially he was favoring acquired, inheritance of acquired traits, but again he was aware of the fact that that does not really work. So, he came up with what is known as the blending theory of inheritance, which basically meant that organisms, for every trait, they passed some part of their body to the germ cells and the sperm and the ova, and then in the offspring these traits get blended. So, you have let us say a tall mother and let us say a short father, then the traits are going to get blended and the offspring is going to be an intermediate between the tallness of the father and the mother. Offspring's height is going to be an intermediate. However, this is something that was objected to immediately by a very brilliant engineer called Fleming Jenkin. This is the person who invented cable cars, okay, but he was also a very well respected scientist, and he argued that look, suppose you have a tall dad or a tall mom and a short dad or a short mom, then if the organism if the offspring is intermediate between the two, then obviously its value is going to be somewhere in the middle. Now, in the next generation, this organism, suppose it again breeds with somebody else and again comes to something in the middle in the next generation, then over time there is going to be a regression towards the mean. In other words, over time all the variation that is there in the population is going to disappear and everybody is going to go towards some kind of a mean value over all the extreme, go towards a mean value rather than going towards an extreme value. If that happens, then all the variation in the population is essentially going to get lost if all the traits are getting blended every generation, and if there is no variation left in the population, then natural selection as a process will cease to operate. Now, Darwin actually had no answer to this particular criticism, and this was a very, very strong criticism. So, if you look at the reactions to Darwin's book, there was a lot of diversity to those reactions. There were lots of people who focused on all the things that Darwin's theory could explain and were convinced that evolution through natural selection is a big deal. There were lots of people who accepted that species can change. Remember, this is a departure from the original God created everything in their present form formulation. However, not everybody accepted that species will necessarily have to change slowly. There were lots of people who thought that changes happened, but they can happen extremely fast, the so called saltation. And the most important bit in Darwin's theory, which is the importance of natural selection, this is what people really contested. Okay, many people thought that natural selection is perhaps not as important as Darwin is making it out to be, and saltationism, which is sudden change within one generation from one form to another, this was for many people a much better alternative to the gradual evolution that Darwin was talking about. And finally, the religious reaction to this entire thing was also extremely varied. There were some people who essentially did not really see this as an affront to their religion, but there were lots of other people who were very perturbed, and a lot of the perturbation was coming explicitly from Darwin's assertion that humans might have an animal origin. God did not really create humans as something special. God did not create humans in his own image. Humans are just, well, basically another ape-like creature. Very interestingly, Carolus Linnaeus, when he had created his original classification, he had explicitly recognized that human beings were very close to the apes. Okay. So, in that sense, Darwin was not the first person to think that humans are perhaps just a modified ape, but yeah, so finally anyway Carolus Linnaeus ended up creating a special genus called Homo for human beings. Although if you look at it properly, there was not much reason for him to create that thing. Basically it was created more to placate the people with a religious bent of mind that human beings have to be a special creation. So anyway, so this particular set of human beings who were worried about the ape origins of humans, they actually had a field day with Darwin, and caricatures like this were extremely common in newspapers, in books, and all kinds of places for several years after Darwin's theory. Now, as I said, a crucial piece of this entire puzzle was the mechanism of inheritance. Okay. Without that, it was very difficult to establish natural selection as a proper mechanism, and this actually gets resolved by the work of this man Gregor Johann Mendel and his laws of inheritance. Now, Mendel proposes his thing in a paper read in 1865. His paper gets published in 1866, 16 years before Darwin's death, and yet there is no evidence to believe that Darwin ever came to know of Mendel's work within his lifetime. If Darwin had come to know of Mendel's work, then given how sharp he was, given how deeply he had thought about it, he would have most probably have figured out that this is the missing puzzle for his work, but yet that did not happen. So, this is one of those great what ifs of the history of science. As it happened, Mendel's work was largely ignored by the scientific community till 1900, when two people, Hugo de Vries and Karl Correns, they independently rediscovered these principles, and when they were trying to publish it, they realized that Mendel has already talked about these principles, and therefore they published their papers, but explicitly acknowledged Mendel as the person who thought about it first. Now, of course, Mendel's inheritance laws have many components, but the major component that was important in this context was the fact that what Mendel called as factors, today we call as genes. Mendel's theory explicitly said that the factors do not blend. The factors pass as it is, as discrete units across generations. Now, the moment Mendel says that, that means that the traits, they do not blend in the offspring, and if they do not blend in the offspring, then variation is going to be maintained. Okay. Of course, selection is going to reduce variation, that is a different ball game, but by itself the process of inheritance is not going to kill the variation. And this realization that this is solving a huge problem in Darwin's theory, this realization actually completely revitalized the work on Darwin and his work. So, prior to this, between 1859 to 1900, as I pointed out, there were lots of oppositions to natural selection as a major mechanism of evolution, but after 1900 things became much better, and between 1900 to 1950 enormous amount of work happened in the context of evolutionary biology. A lot of this work happened in the domain of mathematics, or rather theoretical evolutionary biology. Again, many names, I am just quoting three of the most famous. This is Ronald Fisher, this is J.B.S. Haldane, and this is Sewall Wright. And the work by these people and hundreds of people around them established a very formal mathematical basis for the process of evolution. As a matter of fact, amongst all the subdisciplines of biology, evolution is perhaps one of the most highly mathematized one, okay, maybe along with neurobiology perhaps. So, people were able to show so many things and predict so many things just based on the theory alone. Now, while all this stuff was happening in the domain of theory, an enormous amount of work also happened in the context of experiments, both in the field as well as in the laboratory. Again, hundreds and hundreds of names, okay, and these are people making great contributions. I have just chosen 3 people. So, this on the left hand side is J. Lydiard Stebbins. So, he actually ended up doing a lot of work on evolution of plants. In the middle you have G. Simpson. So, this person was a paleontologist and he did a lot of work about fossils. He was an expert on mammals, but his primary thing was about the rate of evolution. That is what he contributed on. And this person we have already met, this is Theodosius Dobzhansky, and he did a lot of work on Drosophila, but he also did some very important work on natural populations as well, and played a major role in crystallizing the theory as we are going to see. So, all this stuff that happened between 1900 to say 1950 or so, these came out in the form of books, these came out in the form of papers, and in 1942 there was a very famous book written called Evolution, the Modern Synthesis by this person called Julian Huxley. So, around that time, this book is like the shining example, but this is not the only book that contributes to the crystallization. There were at least 5-6 other major books that are also recognized to be very important. So, there was a synthesis of Darwin's insights combined with what was derived from the geneticists, the theoreticians, the experimentalists, the paleontologists, the ecologists, pretty much everybody in science, except to some extent the embryologists, okay, what we today call as a developmental biologists. Somehow their points of view did not properly get integrated into the whole picture, but the insights from all the other fields got incorporated, and you had the what is known as the modern synthesis, which is essentially a bunch of interconnected statements which talks about how evolution happens. And as I pointed out, although this name comes from this particular book by Julian Huxley, in reality the insights are coming from the work of hundreds if not thousands of people roughly between that period. Now, what you study in textbooks, what we are going to talk about in the over this course is primarily this modern synthesis, which with some little changes here and there. Now, of course, what I talked about is till 1940s to 50s, but roughly around 1950s and later is when molecular biology and biochemistry starts making enormous amount of advances. Okay, superb works happen. So, for example, this is Frederick Sanger. He figured out how to sequence proteins and DNAs, and the first thing that he does is he actually ends up doing it for multiple species and studies these species and tries to see what kind of patterns he gets, and essentially he gets similar patterns as what those anatomists got. Okay, if you have species which are, let us say, which have very similar form and function to each other, then their proteins, their DNA often were very close to each other, very similar to each other. Similarly, there was this man called Charles Sibley. He realized that you can actually use the DNA and the protein data to do taxonomy. So, till that point taxonomy was primarily being done on morphological features, but now he said let us look at the molecular data and see what kind of taxonomy we can do, one of the pioneers in the field. And then of course, you have Linus Pauling and Emily Zuckerkandl. So, they were the ones who proposed that if you have differences in protein sequences, then assuming that these differences are happening at a constant rate, you can actually use the amount of difference to predict when exactly these species diverged from each other. So, in other words, when was the common ancestor from which the divergence happened. And then of course, this kind of a data can then be verified with fossil data to see whether it is making sense or not, and spoiler alert, it does. Most of the time there is a pretty reasonable match. So, over the last 75 years, which means after the modern synthesis, an outstanding amount of information has been generated related to DNA sequence, protein sequence, molecular genetics, molecular taxonomy, evolutionary ecology, basically every single sub area of biology. And the interesting information is that because of this, the modern synthesis itself has undergone several modifications. So, what was proposed in 1940s to 50s is not the precise form of the modern synthesis that we evolutionary biologists use today. However, this is the important bit, there has been no major structural change. Okay. Certain new forces have been added. So, for example, Darwin thought natural selection is the force. By the time modern synthesis came in, people realized that natural selection is one of the four major forces of evolutionary biology. Today people are asking, okay, maybe there are some other forces that also need to be considered. Similarly, in terms of variation, all this information about DNA sequences, protein sequences, molecular genetics, etc., that has actually led us to a lot of understanding about how variation is generated, how the variation is transmitted. But the overall picture of how evolution is supposed to operate, that really has not changed, and more importantly, there is no new information amongst the petabytes and petabytes of information that has been generated over the last 75 years, which is inconsistent with the existing theory. Okay. When I said existing theory, I mean modern synthesis in its present form. So, however, in spite of this, in the early 2000s, there were some evolutionary biologists who started asking the question that is the modern synthesis with some little modifications here and there enough to explain all the data that we have, or do we need a major overhaul of this synthesis? And this program of a potential overhaul is what they called the extended synthesis, and this generally is rooted or generally is directed to this very famous book edited by Massimo Pigliucci and Gerd B. Muller, which came out I think in 2016 if I am not mistaken. Okay. So, there is right now a lot of debate in the field on whether incremental changes are enough or a totally new theory called the extended evolutionary synthesis is needed. Okay. Now, please understand one thing, this debate is not about whether evolution happened or not. Both sides on both sides of this are people who accept that evolution has happened. All that the debate is trying to do is to ask whether we need to change the way we look at evolution or not, and if yes, by how much. Okay. Some people are saying, the modern synthesis people are saying that the change is going to be very little, the other guys are saying that no, the change might have to be pretty large, and that is it. It is only about the magnitude of the change, and to the best of our understanding till now whatever changes have been proposed are not large in magnitude, they are relatively small in magnitude, but then that is where the debate is. Okay. So, overall this time in the field of evolutionary biology is perhaps a very exciting time to be an evolutionary biologist, because as I showed you, evolution right now encompasses the entire science of biology, and therefore theories of evolution, talking about it, requires one to have a overall view, overall hold on the entire subject in a way in which no single subdiscipline of biology allows you to do. Okay. So, but if that be the case, what is it that makes EES so controversial? If both sides are in agreement over the broad strokes, why should one be worried, or why should there a debate that really needs to be? And more importantly, if we are saying that most of the things are already answered, then does that mean there are no unanswered questions in evolutionary biology? Obviously not. Okay, there are lots of questions that remain to be answered, but then what are those questions? So, we will invite a prominent evolutionary biologist of India to discuss the two issues that I have flagged above. But before we go there, we have an unfinished business. What is our unfinished business? Remember that in the very first discussion, when we were talking about the alien, we said that there are two questions that need to be resolved, and I said that in order to resolve those two questions, first we need to understand how exactly history of evolutionary thought or the evolution of evolutionary thought happened, right. So, now we have done that. I know I will not say that we have done a very thorough deep job, but we have an overall picture of how evolutionary thought evolved, and with that information now we will go back to our two questions, but that will happen in our next discussion.